An exhausted cop notices a scruffy little dog trailing him through the busy streets of Chicago, refusing to be left behind. At first, he thinks it's just another stray, but when he bends down to check its worn collar, he discovers something unexpected, a crumpled note begging for help. The message is heartbreaking, and when he realizes who wrote it and what's at stake, his life changes forever. Who needs saving? What will he find when he follows the dog? And why does this tiny, determined pup refuse to give up? Before we dive into this emotional journey, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this one, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Officer Daniel Carter pulled his jacket tighter against the sharp evening chill as he walked down a quiet street in Chicago. His shift had stretched longer than expected, and fatigue settled into his bones with every step. The glow of streetlights flickered overhead, casting shadows on cracked sidewalks. But all he could think about was the warmth of his tiny apartment and the promise of sleep. A soft scuffling sound made him pause. Daniel turned, scanning the street behind him. Empty. Probably just a stray cat, he thought, shaking his head. He resumed walking, but the sound followed him. Soft, persistent paws tapping against the pavement. Curious, he glanced over his shoulder again. There, a few feet behind him, stood a scruffy little dog. Its brown fur was matted, patches of dirt clinging to its tiny frame. One ear stood straight up, while the other flopped over, giving it an endearing yet pitiful look. Its ribs showed through its thin coat, and its dark round eyes stared at him intently. Daniel sighed, half smiling. "You lost, buddy?" The dog didn't respond, of course, but its tail wagged faintly. Daniel waved his hand, trying to shoo it away. "Go on now, I'm not your guy." But the little dog didn't budge. Step for step, it followed Daniel as he continued down the street. Every time he turned around, it would pause, sitting down and tilting its head as if pleading silently. "Persistent little thing, aren't you?" Daniel muttered under his breath. His heart tugged, but his building didn't allow pets, and besides, he barely had time to care for himself. "I can't take you home." "Sorry, pal." Still, the dog followed, block after block. Finally, with an exasperated sigh, Daniel crouched down. The dog hesitated, but didn't run. Instead, it inched closer, its tiny body trembling. "All right, let's see who you belong to," Daniel said softly, reaching for the worn leather collar around its neck. As his fingers brushed the collar, he felt something crumpled and uneven. Frowning, he carefully pulled out a small, folded piece of paper tucked inside. His pulse quickened. "What's this?" Unfolding the note, his eyes scanned the shaky handwriting. The letters were uneven, scrawled with the unmistakable clumsiness of a child. The words made his breath catch in his throat. "Help. My brother is sick. No food, no water. Apartment 4C." Daniel froze, the note trembling in his hand. His exhaustion vanished, replaced by a sharp, urgent adrenaline. "Where did you come from?" he whispered, though he already knew. His eyes met the dog's, and for a moment, it felt like the dog understood. Its tail wagged slightly, then it turned and started trotting down the street, pausing only to look back at him. Without a second thought, Daniel stood and followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The scruffy little dog darted ahead, its small paws padding quickly along the cracked Chicago sidewalks. Officer Daniel Carter followed close behind, his mind racing with questions. The note clenched in his hand weighed heavier than it should have, each shaky letter echoing in his head. "Help. My brother is sick. No food. No water. Apartment 4. C." The city's usual sounds faded into the background. Honking cars, distant chatter, the hum of streetlights. All Daniel could focus on was the dog leading him through winding streets and alleyways. He felt the urgency in its every movement, and his own steps quickened in response. Finally, the dog stopped in front of an old, run-down apartment building. Its paint peeled away in long strips, and several windows were covered with cardboard instead of glass. The building loomed like a forgotten relic in the middle of the bustling city, a place where the world had seemingly turned a blind eye. Daniel's chest tightened. He'd seen places like this before, places where hope was a fragile thing, easily lost. The dog looked up at him, its dark eyes pleading. Daniel nodded. "Okay, buddy, I'm here." He stepped through the broken front door that hung on loose hinges, the creak echoing through the dimly lit hallway. The faint buzz of a flickering light overhead did little to chase away the shadows that clung to the walls. The air was thick with dust and a lingering mustiness that spoke of neglect. The dog led him up the creaky stairs, its tail wagging anxiously. 3rd floor. 4th floor. Daniel's pulse quickened with every step. Finally, they reached a door with the number 4C barely hanging onto its tarnished brass plate. Daniel pressed his ear to the door. Silence. Too much silence. His police instinct screamed that something was wrong. He knocked firmly. "Chicago PD! Is anyone in there?" No answer. He knocked harder. "This is Officer Daniel Carter. I'm here to help." Still nothing. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He glanced down at the dog, which whined softly, pawing at the door. His mind made up, Daniel braced himself and kicked near the lock. The door flew open with a splintering crack, and he rushed inside. The smell hit him first. Stale air, unwashed clothes, and something sour that made his stomach turn. His eyes adjusted to the dim interior, scanning the small, cluttered apartment. His breath caught when he spotted them. In the corner of the living room, a young boy, no older than 8, sat clutching a baby wrapped in a thin, worn blanket. The boy's eyes were wide and sunken, his cheeks hollow from hunger. His small arms wrapped protectively around the infant, who lay frighteningly still, save for the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Daniel's heart shattered. "Hey there," he said softly, kneeling down to their level. "I'm Officer Daniel. I'm here to help, okay?" The boy didn't speak, his body tense with fear. He clutched the baby tighter, his lips cracked and trembling. Daniel noticed the boy's clothes, too big, too thin for the cold autumn air, seeping through the cracks in the windows. His tiny ribs were visible beneath his worn shirt. The dog, Daniel's unlikely guide, trotted over to the boy, wagging its tail and gently licking his hand. The boy flinched at first, but then relaxed slightly, recognizing a familiar friend. "Is this your pup?" Daniel asked softly. The boy gave a barely perceptible nod. Daniel's eyes softened. "What's your name, buddy?" The boy hesitated, then whispered, "Ben." "Hi, Ben," Daniel said with a warm, reassuring smile. "And your little brother?" "Ethan," Ben replied, his voice barely audible. Daniel's throat tightened. "Okay, Ben. Ethan looks really sick. We need to get him to a doctor right away. Can I help you?" Ben's eyes filled with tears, but he nodded slowly. He was too tired to resist, too desperate for help to push Daniel away. Daniel pulled out his phone and quickly called for paramedics, keeping his voice calm despite the panic swirling inside him. As he waited, Daniel looked around the apartment. The cupboards in the small kitchen were open and empty. The fridge hummed softly but held nothing but a single, expired carton of milk. A bare mattress lay on the floor, and a broken crib stood in the corner. No toys, no food, no warmth. His eyes landed on a crumpled piece of paper near the trash. He picked it up and read, "We can't do this anymore. No money, no hope. We'll find help and come back. Take care of your brother, Ben. Be strong." Daniel's hands shook with anger and sadness. They hadn't gone to find help. They had abandoned their children. The sound of sirens pierced the air, growing louder as they neared. Ben clung to Ethan as if letting go would shatter him. Daniel placed a gentle hand on Ben's shoulder. "It's okay. I'm not going anywhere." The dog, now sitting protectively beside Ben, let out a soft bark as the paramedics rushed in. Daniel took a deep breath, knowing this was only the beginning. The wail of sirens echoed off the old brick buildings as paramedics rushed into the cramped apartment. Officer Daniel Carter stepped aside, his heart pounding in his chest, as he watched them approach Ben and Ethan. Ben tightened his grip on his baby brother, his small hands trembling. His wide, fearful eyes darted between the strangers in uniforms and Daniel. The scruffy little dog, now firmly rooted by Ben's side, let out a soft, protective growl. One of the paramedics, a woman with gentle eyes, knelt in front of Ben. "Hi there, sweetheart," she said softly. "I'm Megan. Can I take a look at your brother? I promise we'll take good care of him." Ben's lips quivered, but he didn't move. His arms remained locked around Ethan, whose tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, rapid breaths. Daniel crouched beside them, placing a hand on Ben's shoulder. "Ben," he whispered, "I know this is scary, but Ethan needs help. We'll go with him, okay? I won't leave you, I promise." Ben hesitated for a moment longer before finally nodding, his tear-filled eyes trusting Daniel's quiet reassurance. Gently, Megan lifted Ethan from Ben's arms, her face tightening with concern as she felt the baby's feverish skin. She wrapped him in a sterile blanket and laid him on the stretcher, quickly checking his vital signs. "Severe dehydration," Megan muttered to her partner, shaking her head. "We need to get him on fluids immediately." Ben panicked, reaching out as they began to wheel Ethan away. "No, don't take him!" he cried out, his voice cracking with fear. Daniel scooped Ben into his arms, holding him tightly. "We're going with them, buddy. We're not leaving Ethan alone, I promise." The little dog, Scout, as Daniel silently decided to call him, trotted faithfully behind them as they rushed down the stairs and into the waiting ambulance. Inside, the paramedics worked quickly, inserting an IV into Ethan's tiny arm. Ben clung to Daniel's side, his small hands gripping the fabric of Daniel's uniform tightly as he watched his baby brother with tear-filled eyes. Daniel squeezed Ben's hand. "Ethan's a fighter," he whispered, "just like you." The ambulance sped through the streets, sirens wailing, while Daniel's mind raced. What happens next? The question loomed heavy in his heart. He was a cop, not a parent. But as Ben buried his face into Daniel's chest, shaking with silent sobs, Daniel knew one thing for certain. He couldn't walk away from these kids. At the hospital, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as doctors and nurses took Ethan into the emergency room. Ben tried to follow, but a nurse gently held him back. "We need to help your brother, sweetheart. You can see him soon." "No," Ben whimpered, clinging to Daniel. "I need to stay with him. Please." Daniel knelt down beside him. "They'll take care of Ethan," he said gently. "And I'll stay with you until we can see him, okay?" Ben nodded reluctantly, wiping his tear-streaked face on his sleeve. Scout curled up at Ben's feet, as if standing guard. In the waiting area, Daniel made a quick call to Child Protective Services. Minutes later, a social worker named Amanda arrived, holding a clipboard and offering a polite but tired smile. Daniel recognized the look in her eyes, one he'd seen too often, the look of someone who had seen too many kids abandoned, too many hearts broken. "Officer Carter," she greeted. "I understand you found the children?" Daniel nodded. "Ben and his baby brother, Ethan. No parents in sight, just this." He handed her the crumpled note he'd found in the apartment. Amanda sighed softly as she read the shaky handwriting. "Unfortunately, it's not uncommon. Parents overwhelmed by poverty, addiction, or worse, leaving their kids behind." She looked at Ben, who sat quietly, his hand never leaving Scout's fur. "We'll find an emergency foster placement for them tonight." Daniel's stomach twisted. He knew the system. It was overburdened, stretched too thin. Too many kids got lost in it, shuffled from one temporary home to another. The thought of Ben and Ethan being sent to strangers after everything they had been through made his chest ache. As Amanda filled out her paperwork, Daniel sat down beside Ben. "Hey, buddy," he said softly. "Do you have any family? Anyone I can call?" Ben shook his head slowly. "Just Mom and Dad," he whispered, barely audible. "But they're not coming back." Daniel's heart broke at the quiet acceptance in Ben's voice, the voice of a child who had lost hope too many times. "Do you remember the last time you ate, Ben?" Ben hesitated, then shook his head. "I tried to make the baby bottles last," he whispered, "but they ran out." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "You did so good taking care of your brother," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You're so brave." Ben didn't respond, but he leaned into Daniel's side just a little more. Later, as Daniel watched Ben doze off in the chair, Scout curled protectively at his feet. The weight of the situation hit him fully. They need someone. They need me. Daniel found Amanda at the front desk, finishing up her paperwork. Before she could hand it over, Daniel spoke. "I'll take them." Amanda blinked in surprise. "Officer Carter, fostering isn't something you can decide on a whim. There's paperwork, background checks, home studies." "I know," Daniel interrupted. "I know it's not simple, but these boys, they don't need temporary. They need someone to stay." Amanda studied him carefully. "Do you know what you're taking on? 2 traumatized children, one of them an infant." "I know," Daniel said softly, "but I can't leave them." Amanda nodded slowly, seeing the determination in his eyes. "Okay," she whispered, "we'll start the process, but tonight, they're going home with you." Daniel let out a slow breath of relief. As he carried Ben, still fast asleep, out to his car, Scout trotting behind him, Daniel whispered a promise into the quiet night. "You're not alone anymore." The quiet hum of the hospital's night shift faded as Officer Daniel Carter carried Ben through the softly lit parking lot. The little boy's head rested on Daniel's shoulder, his breathing steady but fragile, as if, even in sleep, the weight of his young life clung to him. In his other hand, Daniel held Ethan's carrier, the baby swaddled tightly and sleeping soundly after receiving fluids and care. Scout, the scruffy little dog who had brought them all together, trotted at Daniel's feet, never straying too far from the boys. As Daniel approached his car, a wave of doubt washed over him. Can I really do this? 2 kids? A dog? He thought of his small home, the quiet, simple life he'd built for himself. But then he remembered the fear in Ben's eyes, the desperate note, and Ethan's fragile form. His heart answered before his mind could. Yes, I have to. The drive home was silent, except for the soft whimpers Ben made in his sleep and Scout's gentle panting. Daniel kept glancing at them in the rearview mirror. The weight of responsibility felt immense, but something deep inside him felt right. When they arrived, Daniel carefully carried Ben into the house, laying him on the couch with a soft blanket tucked around him. He set Ethan's carrier down nearby, the baby still peacefully asleep. Scout curled up on the floor beside Ben, his brown eyes watching Daniel as if to say, "We've got this." Daniel exhaled deeply and rubbed the back of his neck. "Well, Scout," he whispered, "looks like it's not just me and bad takeout anymore." The next morning, Daniel's small, modest home was filled with new sounds. Ethan's soft cries, Ben's sleepy murmurs, and Scout's energetic tail thumping against the floor. Daniel moved quietly around the kitchen, pouring cereal into a bowl and adding milk. Ben sat at the table, rubbing his eyes. "Where's Ethan?" he asked softly, his voice still groggy. "In the bedroom," Daniel replied gently. "He's sleeping, buddy." Ben nodded, relaxing slightly. "He gets scared when I'm not there," he whispered. Daniel sat across from him. "I know, but he's safe here. You both are." The boy didn't respond, but focused on his cereal instead. Daniel didn't push. He knew trust wouldn't come easily. Later that day, a knock at the door startled Daniel. Amanda, the social worker, stood on the porch holding a stack of papers and a warm but cautious smile. "Officer Carter," she greeted. "May I come in?" Daniel stepped aside, offering a small smile. "Call me Daniel," he said, motioning her in. She glanced around, noting the clean but lived-in space, the baby toys already scattered, and Ben sitting on the floor playing with Scout. "Looks like you've had a busy morning," she commented softly. Daniel chuckled nervously. "Yeah, you could say that." Amanda sat down at the kitchen table, spreading out the paperwork. "We need to go over some details. Fostering isn't easy, Daniel. There are home visits, financial checks, emotional evaluations." "I know," Daniel interrupted gently, "but they need someone, and I need them too." Amanda looked at him carefully. "This isn't just about saving them, Daniel. It's about being there every day, through tantrums, sleepless nights, and heartaches." Daniel nodded. "I've faced worse," he said softly, thinking of his time as a cop. "I'm ready." Amanda sighed but smiled. "All right, let's get started." The following days were a whirlwind. Daniel baby-proofed his house, bought a crib for Ethan, and set up a small bed for Ben in the spare room. Scout followed him everywhere, his tail wagging like he knew they were building something important. The first night, after Daniel had tucked Ethan into the crib and set up a nightlight, he found Ben sitting cross-legged on the floor, his blanket clutched tightly. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said softly, kneeling beside him. "You can sleep on the bed, you know. It's yours." Ben shook his head. "I don't need it," he whispered. Daniel's heart ached. He knew Ben wasn't rejecting comfort. He just didn't believe he deserved it yet. "Okay," Daniel whispered, "but if you change your mind, it's yours." As Daniel walked to his own room, he whispered to himself, "One day, Ben, one day you'll feel safe enough to take the bed." Scout settled at Ben's feet, offering silent companionship. And as Daniel lay awake that night, listening to the quiet sounds of his new family, he knew one thing for sure. He had made the right choice. This wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worthwhile ever was. The days in Daniel Carter's small Chicago home settled into a fragile rhythm. Mornings were filled with sleepy yawns, cereal bowls clinking, and the soft coos of baby Ethan as he kicked happily in his crib. Ben, quiet but observant, sat at the kitchen table each morning, his dark eyes always watching Daniel, watching Scout, and most of all, watching Ethan. Scout, ever the loyal shadow, stayed close to Ben's side, as if the little dog sensed that the boy's heart was still hidden behind invisible walls. One chilly autumn morning, Daniel found Ben staring out the window, knees pulled to his chest, Scout curled beside him. "Hey, buddy," Daniel said softly, leaning against the doorframe. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ben shrugged, his small fingers tracing invisible patterns on the frosted glass. "Nothing," he whispered. But Daniel knew better. He'd seen that look before, the silent storm brewing inside. He decided not to press, but the worry settled deep in his chest. The first crack in Ben's wall appeared on a Monday afternoon. Daniel was folding laundry when his phone buzzed. It was the school's number. His heart clenched. "Hello? Mr. Carter, this is Principal Hayes. Ben had a situation at school today." Daniel's stomach dropped. "What happened?" "There was an incident with some other students," the principal explained. "We need to talk." At the school, Daniel found Ben sitting outside the principal's office, clutching his backpack tightly, his knuckles white. His face was blank, but Daniel saw the storm behind his eyes. The principal explained that some older boys had teased Ben about his new cop dad and his scruffy dog. Ben, usually silent, had finally snapped, pushing one of the boys to the ground. "Physical confrontation is unacceptable," the principal said sternly. Daniel nodded, but his heart ached. How many times had Ben been pushed before he finally pushed back? As they walked home in silence, Daniel finally spoke. "You want to talk about it?" Ben shook his head. Daniel sighed. "Okay, but I'm here when you're ready." That evening, as Daniel tucked Ethan into his crib, he found Ben sitting on the living room floor, Scout's head resting on his lap. Daniel sat beside him. "You know," Daniel began softly, "I've had bad days too." Ben didn't look up. "When I was a rookie cop, people said stuff, hurtful stuff," Daniel continued. "But you know what I learned? Sometimes being strong means not fighting back with your fists." Ben's eyes flicked toward Daniel for a moment. "Then how?" he whispered. "By knowing who you are," Daniel replied. "By trusting the people who care about you." Ben's fingers tightened in Scout's fur. "I don't know how to do that," he admitted, his voice barely audible. Daniel's heart broke a little more. "That's okay," he said gently. "We'll figure it out together." Over the next few weeks, small cracks began to form in Ben's walls. Daniel noticed it in the way Ben stopped hoarding food under his pillow, the way he started leaving his bedroom door open just a crack at night, the way he let Daniel sit beside him on the couch without tensing up. One night, after a particularly long day, Daniel found Ben in the nursery, gently rocking Ethan back to sleep. Scout sat at Ben's feet, his tail wagging softly. "Hey," Daniel whispered, "didn't know you were on baby duty." Ben shrugged. "He cries a lot less when I'm here." Daniel chuckled softly. "Must be your magic touch." Ben hesitated. "It's just, he needs someone. I know what that feels like." Daniel's throat tightened. "Yeah, me too," he whispered. A thunderstorm rolled through one night, rattling windows and illuminating the dark sky with bright flashes. Daniel, half asleep, was startled by a soft knock at his bedroom door. "Come in," he called groggily. Ben stood there, clutching Scout in his arms, his eyes wide with fear. Can I stay here?" he whispered. Daniel's heart swelled. "Of course." As Ben curled up in the chair beside Daniel's bed, Scout nestled in his lap. Daniel watched him drift off to sleep, the boy's breathing finally steady and calm. For the first time, Ben had allowed someone to hold his fears without running away. In the quiet of the night, Daniel made a silent promise. "No matter how long it takes, no matter how hard it gets, I'm here. We're family now." Winter crept into Chicago quietly, bringing crisp mornings and soft blankets of snow. The once bare living room window of Daniel Carter's house now had tiny handprints on the glass. Ethan's fascination with snowflakes evident every time he pressed his chubby fingers to the cold surface. Ben, bundled up in a worn hoodie and scarf, sat beside him, quietly watching the snow fall. Scout, now well-fed and full of energy, curled up by Ben's side, his ears perking up at every distant sound. The house, once silent and solitary, now felt full of sounds, full of warmth, and most of all, full of love. The mornings became routine. Daniel would wake to Ethan's cheerful babbles, the baby's tiny arms reaching up for him from the crib. Ben, always up early, would already be in the kitchen, pouring cereal for himself and refilling Scout's water bowl. "Morning, buddy," Daniel greeted one chilly morning, ruffling Ben's hair. Ben shrugged but offered a small smile. It wasn't much, but Daniel knew it meant everything. Ethan giggled from his high chair, throwing cereal pieces onto the floor, which Scout happily devoured. "Guess you're on cleanup duty," Daniel joked, making Ben chuckle softly. Moments like these felt like miracles, small, fleeting, but precious. As the months passed, Ben began to change. The haunted look in his eyes faded, replaced by cautious curiosity. He started making friends at school, particularly a boy named Tommy who shared his love for drawing comics. One afternoon, Daniel watched from the front porch as Ben raced up the sidewalk, cheeks flushed from the cold, waving a piece of paper. "Look what Tommy and I made," Ben exclaimed, holding up a hand-drawn comic strip. Scout barked happily, circling around Ben's feet. Daniel grinned. "That's awesome! Superheroes?" Ben nodded. "Yeah, but Tommy says my hero looks more like you." Daniel's heart swelled, but he only ruffled Ben's hair, laughing. "I don't know about that, but I'll take it." The day Daniel had been waiting for finally arrived on a chilly March afternoon. Ben came home from school to find Daniel pacing the living room, a thick manila envelope on the coffee table. "Everything okay?" Ben asked, setting his backpack down carefully. Daniel nodded, though his hands were shaking slightly. "Actually, yeah. There's something I need to show you." Ben sat down, Scout hopping up beside him. Daniel picked up the envelope, hesitating for a moment before handing it over. Ben opened it slowly, pulling out a stack of papers. His eyes scanned the words, confusion clouding his face, until realization hit him like a wave. "Adoption?" Ben whispered, looking up at Daniel, his voice barely audible. Daniel nodded, his voice soft but steady. "Yeah. I want to make this official, Ben. You and Ethan, I want you both to be my sons. For real." Ben's hands trembled as he clutched the papers. You want us?" Daniel's voice broke as he replied, "More than anything." Ben's face crumpled, tears streaming down his cheeks. For the first time since they met, he didn't hold back. He launched himself into Daniel's arms, sobbing quietly into his shoulder. Scout, sensing the emotion, whined softly, nuzzling into Ben's side. "You mean it?" Ben whispered, his voice cracking. "Every word," Daniel promised. Ben nodded against Daniel's shoulder, whispering one simple, powerful word. "Okay." The courtroom was filled with the smell of polished wood and the soft shuffle of papers. Ben sat stiffly beside Daniel, clutching Ethan's tiny hand, while Scout waited patiently at home. The judge, an older woman with kind eyes, smiled gently at Ben. "Do you want Daniel Carter to be your legal father?" Ben's heart pounded, but his voice was strong and clear as he replied, "Yes." The judge's pen moved across the document, and just like that, they became a family. As they left the courthouse, Daniel squeezed Ben's shoulder. "How does it feel, kiddo?" Ben smiled, a real, genuine smile, like I finally have a home. That night, as Daniel tucked Ben into bed, Scout curled up at his feet. Ben looked up at him with wide, vulnerable eyes. "Good night, Dad," Ben whispered. Daniel's heart skipped a beat. He leaned down, pressing a soft kiss to Ben's forehead. "Good night, son. Love you." Ben's voice was barely a whisper, but Daniel heard it clear as day. "Love you too." In the stillness of the night, Daniel sat on the couch, Scout by his side, reflecting on the journey that brought them together. Love wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. Chapter 7. Facing the Past. The soft glow of the afternoon sun filtered through the living room window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Ben sat on the couch, carefully stacking blocks for Ethan, who giggled as he knocked them down each time. Scout lay at their feet, his tail thumping lazily against the floor, eyes half closed, but always alert. Daniel Carter sat at the kitchen table, sorting through bills and case files from work when his phone buzzed unexpectedly. Glancing at the screen, his body tensed. An unknown number. He almost ignored it, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" A hesitant voice crackled through the line. Is Ben okay?" Daniel's hand tightened around the phone. He recognized that voice instantly. Samantha Miller, Ben and Ethan's biological mother. "Why are you calling?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice steady, though his heart pounded. I just needed to know," Samantha whispered. "I've been trying to get better. I didn't mean to leave them for so long. I wasn't thinking clearly, but I'm different now. I've been working, saving money. I just want to see them." Daniel's jaw clenched as memories of the abandoned apartment flooded back. Empty cupboards, a sick baby, and a terrified boy left to fend for themselves. He pictured Ben curled up on the floor that first night, too scared to sleep in a bed, and Ethan's fragile body hooked up to hospital machines. "You abandoned them," Daniel said, his voice low and cold. "You left an 8-year-old to care for a baby with no food, no water. You don't get to just show up now." "Please," Samantha begged, her voice cracking. "I'm their mother." Daniel's anger simmered, but he ended the call without another word. He sat in silence, the weight of the call pressing down on him. His mind raced. Should he tell Ben? Would this reopen wounds that were just beginning to heal? That evening, Daniel watched Ben push his food around his plate, lost in thought. Even Scout's gentle nudges couldn't draw him out. It was as if Ben sensed something was wrong. After dinner, as they cleaned up, Ben's small voice broke the silence. "Do you think they'll ever come back?" Daniel froze, almost dropping the dish in his hand. He hadn't mentioned the call, yet Ben's question felt hauntingly timed. He dried his hands and guided Ben to the couch. Sitting down beside him, Scout curled up at their feet. Daniel spoke gently. "I don't know, Ben, but I do know this. Family isn't about who leaves, it's about who stays." Ben's fingers tightened in Scout's fur. The clock ticked softly in the background as Ben whispered, "You stayed." Daniel swallowed the lump in his throat. "Always," he replied firmly. Days passed, but Daniel couldn't shake the call from his mind. Finally, he made his decision. "Ben," he said one evening after Ethan had been put to bed, "we need to talk." Ben's eyes flickered with worry as he sat on the couch, Scout pressing close to his side. "Your mom called," Daniel said softly. Ben's body went rigid. She did?" Daniel nodded. "She says she's sorry. She wants to see you." The room fell silent. Ben's expression was unreadable, but his hands gripped Scout's fur tightly. Daniel waited, giving him space. Finally, Ben whispered, "What did you say?" "I told her she doesn't get to just come back after everything," Daniel replied honestly. "But this isn't my choice. It's yours." Ben stared at the floor for a long time. Finally, he shook his head slowly. "She always said tomorrow would be better, that she'd fix things, but she never did." His voice cracked, and Daniel's heart broke all over again. "I don't want to see her," Ben said quietly. "I have you and Ethan, and Scout. That's enough." Daniel pulled Ben into a tight hug, feeling the boy tremble against him. "Okay," he whispered. "Whatever you need, I'm here." Later that night, Daniel watched as Ben quietly dropped the letter into the trash. There was no anger, no hesitation, just quiet acceptance. As Ben walked away, Scout trotting at his heels, Daniel felt a sense of relief. Ben had chosen to leave the past behind, and Daniel silently promised that the future would be better than any tomorrow Ben had ever been promised. The soft glow of the morning sun filled Daniel Carter's kitchen as the smell of cinnamon and freshly baked bread wafted through the house. It was their first real holiday together, and Daniel was determined to make it unforgettable. Ben sat at the table, carefully drawing on a piece of construction paper, his brow furrowed in concentration. Scout lay at his feet, tail thumping rhythmically as baby Ethan babbled in his high chair, smearing mashed sweet potatoes across his face and tray. "What are you working on, buddy?" Daniel asked, placing a tray of pumpkin muffins on the counter. Ben looked up, a shy smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. It's a Thanksgiving card," he mumbled, quickly covering the paper with his hand. Daniel chuckled softly, knowing better than to push. "Well, it smells like Thanksgiving in here, doesn't it?" Ben nodded, his eyes sparkling as he sniffed the air. "It smells nice, like a real holiday." Daniel's heart warmed at those words. For so long, Ben's holidays had been filled with empty cupboards and broken promises. Not this time. Not anymore. Later that afternoon, Daniel bustled around the kitchen, checking on the turkey, stirring pots, and arranging the table. The front doorbell rang, and Ben jumped up to answer it. "Hey, Ben!" Officer Sarah greeted warmly, holding a basket of homemade dinner rolls. Behind her, Daniel's partner, Mike, and his family followed, carrying trays of food and gifts. The house quickly filled with laughter and chatter. Ben, initially hovering at the edge of the room, soon found himself drawn into conversations. Mike's kids invited him to play with them in the living room, and Scout happily joined in, chasing after toy cars and wagging his tail. Daniel watched from the kitchen, smiling as Ben slowly came out of his shell. This was what he had hoped for, a home filled with warmth, love, and the sound of children's laughter. At dinner, Daniel raised his glass. "Before we eat, I thought we could go around the table and say what we're thankful for." One by one, the guests shared their gratitude: family, health, friendships. When it was Ben's turn, he shifted uncomfortably in his chair, eyes fixed on his plate. "I guess I'm thankful for Scout," he said softly, his cheeks reddening. The table chuckled softly, but Daniel noticed the hesitation in Ben's voice, as if there was more he wanted to say. Then, just loud enough for Daniel to hear, Ben added, "And you." Daniel felt his heart swell, fighting back the lump in his throat. "I'm thankful for you too, Ben," he replied gently. As the evening wound down, the guests began to leave, and Daniel started cleaning up the kitchen. He found Ben in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the floor with Scout curled up beside him. "Did you have a good day?" Daniel asked, sitting down next to him. Ben nodded, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "Yeah, it felt nice." Daniel ruffled Ben's hair. "There's going to be plenty more days like this, I promise." Ben looked up at him, and for the first time, Daniel saw a spark of hope in his eyes. "Really?" "Really," Daniel assured him. As Ben leaned back against the couch, Scout resting his head in Ben's lap, Daniel knew that while their journey hadn't been easy, every step had led them to this moment. A family built not by blood, but by love and unwavering faith. A soft winter breeze whispered through the bare branches outside, as Daniel Carter stood by the kitchen window, sipping his coffee. Snowflakes gently drifted down, covering the streets of Chicago in a pristine white blanket. Inside the house, warmth radiated from every corner, not just from the crackling fireplace, but from the quiet presence of love that had grown stronger with each passing day. Laughter echoed from the living room, and Daniel peeked around the corner to see Ben sprawled on the floor, building a tower out of wooden blocks with baby Ethan. Scout, now a well-fed and energetic little dog, wagged his tail excitedly, occasionally knocking over the blocks with his nose, much to Ethan's delight. "That's Scout! No!" Ben scolded, though his wide grin betrayed his amusement. Ethan giggled uncontrollably, his tiny hands clapping together. Daniel chuckled softly, savoring the sight. This was their life now, a far cry from the fearful, quiet boy who had once refused to trust anyone. That evening, after Ethan was tucked into bed and Scout had settled in his cozy corner, Daniel sat at the dining table, going through some paperwork. Ben, freshly showered and in his pajamas, hovered nearby. "Need something, bud?" Daniel asked, looking up. Ben shuffled his feet awkwardly. "Can I sit with you?" "Of course," Daniel said, motioning to the chair beside him. Ben sat down, resting his chin on his knees. Silence stretched between them, comfortable but expectant. Daniel could feel that something was on Ben's mind. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Ben asked, "Do you ever regret taking us in?" Daniel's head shot up, his eyes widening in surprise. "Ben, no. Never. Not for a single moment." Ben's fingers traced the edge of the table. "Even when it was hard?" "Especially when it was hard," Daniel replied gently. "Because that's when family matters most." Ben nodded slowly, absorbing Daniel's words. His eyes glistened, but he blinked the tears away quickly. "Can I ask you something else?" Ben whispered, his voice almost trembling. "Anything," Daniel assured him. Ben took a deep breath, his small fingers twisting in the fabric of his pajama pants. "Can I call you Dad?" Daniel's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Then, with a lump in his throat and his heart pounding in his chest, He reached out and pulled Ben into a tight embrace. "I'd love that more than anything," Daniel whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I've always wanted to be your dad." Ben clung to him, silent tears soaking into Daniel's shirt. Scout, sensing the emotion in the room, patted over and rested his head on Ben's lap. From that night on, everything felt different, not in the big flashy way the world often expected change to look, but in the quiet moments that mattered most, the whispered "good night, Dad" before bed. The way Ben's hand found Daniel's without hesitation when they crossed the street. The sound of Ben's laughter, full, free, and unguarded. Months passed, and spring breathed new life into the city. Ben thrived in school, no longer the shy boy who kept to the shadows. He made friends, played soccer, and even invited classmates over, something Daniel never thought he'd see. Ethan took his first steps in their living room, with Scout barking excitedly and Ben cheering him on. Every milestone, big or small, was celebrated together, each one a testament to how far they had come. One afternoon, as Daniel watched Ben and Ethan play in the backyard, Scout darting around them, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. They weren't just a foster family anymore. They were a family in every sense of the word. Ben's simple words that night, "I love you, Dad," had changed everything. It wasn't just a title. It was a promise, a bond, and a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected moments lead us to the love we never knew we needed. As Daniel sipped his coffee, he whispered to himself, "We found each other when we needed it most." Scout looked up at him as if understanding, his tail wagging softly. This was their beginning, and it was beautiful. Their story wasn't just about survival. It was about hope, love, and the power of never giving up. Sometimes family isn't about blood, but about those who choose to stand by you, no matter what. If this story touched your heart, remember, there's always hope, even in the darkest moments. Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories that remind us of the strength of love and resilience. Because sometimes all it takes is one faithful step to change everything.